Hello and welcome to day 118. We have 2 Samuel chapter 3, 1 Chronicles chapter 12, and Matthew chapter 15. In 2 Samuel, we have a list of the sons of David at this point. It, I know sometimes it's really tempting to just kind of skip over the lists of people as we come across them in the Bible, but this is one list that you're going to want to pay a little bit of attention to because the names and the sons that are listed here are going to show up again in the story of David. David ends up with a very long life, and it ends up being a very complicated and messy life with some serious family dynamic issues going on. And so some of these names are going to come up again. So definitely remember some of the things that you're seeing here. Then we get to the complicated story of the death of Abner. There is a continuing fight between Judah and Israel, and this is a revenge killing. This is just kind of a messy chapter that's just kind of hard to read and understand some of the dynamics of what's going on. We also have the return of David's wife, Michal, his first wife that was given to him by King Saul's daughter. And we see the grief of her existing husband as he follows Michal, trying to get her back, and is rebuffed and has to go home alone. I think this is just really hard to read and understand in our context today because it's really clear that feelings don't matter. This is a political move. David is trying to show his claim to Saul's kingdom by taking on Saul's daughter again as a wife. And it is hard when we are trying to create a world where all people have more agency. Some people say have more choice in their life decisions. And so this is hard to read. There's nothing that says what Michal thinks about this change and what's going on here. And as we go through David's story, I think it just seems like a really long way from the beautiful moment when the prophet Saul finds young David. I think he was the eighth of the sons of Jesse, and anoints him as king in front of his brothers when he is probably 8, 10, 12 years old. And it's just a really complicated and messy process for David to become the king and unite the kingdom. I think we have to remember that anointing by God does not mean our life will be easy. Look at how difficult life for John the Baptist has been. And David, he does become king and he has power and he's got good looks and people like him, but he has a tough life and it's not easy. It's complicated. There's a lot of politics involved. There's a lot of military strategy involved. And I think a lot of times we just want an easy life and we turn to Jesus and we think about, oh, my yoke is easy and the burden is light. And Jesus does say that, and that is meant for people who are existing in an oppressive situation, in a place where there's a lack of justice, where there's just a real struggle for day to day life. But there's also a lot of people in the Bible where God clearly expects a lot of them, and David is one of them. And God expects us to do the hard work of trying to build God's kingdom and make our way in our earthly life. So I think David, one of the lessons of reading through David's life is that life is hard and complicated, even when we're anointed and chosen by God. First Chronicles 12, we have a list. Of course, we have a list. Chronicles loves lists. And these are the people who joined David while he's fleeing from Saul. There's also, in addition to the naming of people, there's a statistical list, the numbers of people who support David. And it is clear here that the author is making a case for David as the rightful king of a united Israel. And this makes me reflect, what data do we use today to determine legitimacy in our world? Who do we respect and follow? Do we use God's guidance or rely on the internet and reputational comments from other people? And I think as we think through what Chronicles is doing here, they're laying the case that David was a good king and a right king. And we have to make a lot of similar decisions as to who our leaders are going to be, who are we going to respect, who are we going to obey, who are we going to give our loyalty to. And I think sometimes we don't take time to really think through, how are we making those decisions? Are we relying on the wisdom of God through the Holy Spirit? What are the sources of data that we turn to? And I think that's something for us to reflect on. In Matthew chapter 15, we have another debate between Jesus and the Pharisees and religious authorities over what are the rules and how do we obey or use them. Ultimately, this becomes a spirit of the law versus a letter of the law debate. And one of the things that I think is interesting here in verses 10 to 11, Jesus says, it's not what goes in, but what comes out that matters. This is a reference to the kosher dietary laws, the rules of what the Jewish people can eat and not eat, that were a big part of Jewish life at the time. And Jesus is like, it's not what we put in our mouth, which eventually is going to go through us and come out the other end, which he points out in another couple of verses. But what comes out of our mouths comes from the heart. What comes out of our mouths is what we choose to say, what we choose to do. And what we believe and who we believe in is better seen by what comes out of our mouth than by what goes into our mouth. So, this teaching of Jesus, in addition to the vision that Peter has in the book of Acts, are really the foundation for how Christians do not follow the same dietary rules that the Jewish believers follow. So I think as we go through here, just as we reflect on how do we decide who our leaders are, which rules do we focus on, and how do we focus on them? Some Christians right now are really putting a big emphasis on the Ten Commandments. Others look to the Golden Rule. And all of them end up giving us really hard decisions. If we want to do unto others as others do unto us, if we want due process, then do we need to offer due process to our neighbors, even neighbors that we don't trust or even don't like? Um, if we want certain rights about our medical choices, then do we give those same rights for medical choices to other people, such as transgender people or pregnant women? It's really easy to, in some cases, say, oh, this is black, this is white, this is right, this is wrong. But when we're living out the messiness of day to day living, we start to see that sometimes it's really tough to figure out, how do we apply the rules in our daily lives. These are difficult decisions. And sometimes we have to figure out how to agree to disagree and find a space that we can all live together, even if we are following the rules in different ways. Next, we have an interesting story about a Canaanite woman. So, the Canaanites were the people in Israel, an area of land that was also called Canaan, where there's a lot of different people living there. And when the Israelites came back from Egypt, they didn't clear everyone out of the area. And so there are some still people living in this area. Sometimes they're called Philistines, sometimes they're called Canaanites, but these are people who do not worship God. They are not following the Jewish religion. This Canaanite woman comes to Jesus and begs for help for healing for a child. And Jesus is like, I'm here for the Jewish people, go away. Which is a little hard to listen to, because we've seen other places where Jesus is very open to talking to people who are not with the core Jewish people that he's working with. But the woman begs and shows faith and doesn't leave. And then there's this odd reference to dogs where she's like, well, even the dogs get the scraps of the table. First thing I want to say is that in this time period, dogs aren't really pets the way we have them today, where they're almost a member of the family, or in some cases, they are a member of the family. Dogs back then are really more like scavengers. They were always hanging around, and some people definitely probably had interactions with them, but they cleaned stuff up. The stuff that fell off the table, they would eat so that there wouldn't be rodents around and there wouldn't be bugs around. And so she's willing to call herself a scavenger, to be less than the Jewish people, but she believes in Jesus and she demands healing from Jesus. And Jesus affirms her faith and offers the healing. So Jesus has a priority for certain people, but is willing to help anyone who believes. And then the last bit here, we've got another feeding miracle. In this case, Jesus feeds 4,000. Now, again, this is a group of people that has taken time out of their lives to come and gather around Jesus for healing, for teaching, to learn, to be with him, to know more about God. Uh, they need food, and so Jesus works with the disciples and takes what food they find and manages to feed 4,000 people with it. Our reflection for this, I really, as we're reading through the Samuel readings and reading here, it really strikes me that there's a lot of things we take for granted in our life today. We take for granted we have easy access to food. In fact, our problem is too much food, and we have to work not to eat all the food that's around us. We also have um, take for granted our security. We have very low crime rates. We don't have a lot of people directly attacking us in the United States. And for a long time, we have had great security. We've got a lot of medical care access here, although there are definitely groups of people and regions of the country that have less access to medical care. But I think we forget the constant violence, the food insecurity, the lack of healing opportunities that most humans have lived with through most of human history. And so the emphasis on these areas as we're reading through the Bible, we really need to think about what life was like 100, 150 years ago when people had weapons in their homes, when everyone had some basic training in self-defense, when food was scarce and it took a lot of time to prepare food, to grow food, to store food. Um, and we did have a lot of ways to heal injuries and heal illnesses. And I think we need to think, how quickly could these privileges and benefits that we have disappear? What would we do if we didn't have the type of access to medical care and food, if we didn't have the type of security we have right now? And I think when we take some time to think about this, we may have a better understanding of some of the things that the psalmist is writing about and some of the stories that we're reading about, because people are really living in a world with very different resources than what we have today. So enjoy the resources that you have today, give thanks for them, and think about the ways that we can share our resources with those who are still struggling in our world today. We'll see you next time.